When you reach a sky-high number of deadly overdoses, well, any downturn is going to be welcome.
Recently, the Seattle police chief said officers in the first 3 months of the year seized enough fentanyl on the streets to kill the entire city population.
Drug and alcohol abuse are the leading cause of preventable illness and death across the U.S. In 2023, more than 100,000 people in the U.S. died of an overdose, roughly the population of Ventura, California.
In cities like Seattle, drug addiction is a public health crisis as fentanyl, a synthetic opioid 100 times stronger than morphine, has flooded the illegal drug market.
In 2024, the toxic drug supply killed more than 1,500 people in Seattle alone. While first responders fight this public health crisis on the streets, scientists around the globe are waging their own kind of battle.
So as a neuroscientist, I'm obviously interested in helping to contribute in understanding why fentanyl is so addictive.
I'm Amity Idrisi.
I'm Liz DeWicki, and this is Lab Notes.
Contrary to many other diseases, addiction is not a disease where people are sick because they lost cells.
That's Dr. Christian Luescher, an addiction expert and neuroscientist at the University of Geneva.
They are changing their behavior because the circuits change their function, and the cellular mechanism through which this occurs is synaptic plasticity.
Synaptic plasticity, that is, the brain's ability to adapt and modify neural connections.
That is, the plasticity of the transmission from one neuron to the next is the crucial mechanism through which the circuits change their function and eventually lead to this compulsive use despite negative consequences that defines addiction. There are now investigations to directly target the addiction circuits themselves. And that is, however, still in an experimental phase and mostly in animal research.
When I was steeped in my addiction, it was just like automatic, compulsive. I didn't have any defense against it. There is no defense. That's the power and the pull that drugs or alcohol has on people. There is no defense. I mean, there just isn't.
John Wilson is in recovery from addiction and now helps others fight the same battle at the Recovery Cafe in downtown Seattle, an organization that offers support and resources for addiction, homelessness, and mental health.
I worked right down the street right here at the antique store. I worked all day and I obsessed about it. I couldn't wait to get off. I used to have a drug dealer meet me right at the bus stop, right across the street from the Recovery Cafe. You think somebody that works hard for their money, they would want to make some kind of valuable use of it. But when you're in your addiction, that's where that money's going. There's no intervention there.
We invited John and Recovery Cafe founder Killian No to provide first-hand insight into addiction, overdose, and what they believe are solutions to this public health crisis.
Every Sunday when I come to the Recovery Cafe, I always have to move some cardboard boxes. I always have to move some aluminum foil, lighters. It's, the same thing you guys probably see all the time. It is personal,
And we have to be careful not to demonize the people dying of fentanyl because it's deadly, for all the reasons that we understand. But it's to the person who is craving that high. It's no different than the person craving that drink at the end of the day or whatever. It's just that this is a drug that has been unleashed that can kill you just like that.
And that is what happened to a friend of John's shortly before he sat down with us. Over the years, he's lost many friends to overdose and is grateful for his own life and sobriety.
And I lost my innocence.
John started using drugs and alcohol when he was a teenager in New Jersey. He remembers growing up in a supportive home and believes his relationship with drugs started by trying to fit in with his peers.
We used to all hang together, but I didn't feel a part of them because I wasn't doing what they were doing. But the minute I picked up a drink, I felt like I was a part of them.
Once the addiction took hold, it changed his life and sense of right and wrong.
There was one particular time, I was sitting in my parents' house, the house that I was raised in. And physically, I was being tortured. And I was sitting on a spiral staircase crying because I was getting ready to stage a robbery in the house. I was getting ready, they was going to bury my father. And the reason I was crying is because I couldn't stop myself. Whatever moral value I had, I couldn't stop myself. And that's the disease factor right there.
Addiction is not a disease where people are sick because they lost cells, because cells die. This is simply not the case. They are changing their behavior because the circuits change their function. And the cellular mechanism through which this occurs is synaptic plasticity.
Along with specializing in addiction research at the University of Geneva, Christian Luescher works with patients suffering from addiction. He began looking at this through the lens of neuroscience when he was a postdoc in California, specifically the role synaptic plasticity plays in chemical dependency.
The neural plasticity, or more specifically synaptic plasticity, that is the plasticity of the transmission from one neuron to the next, is the crucial mechanism through which the circuits change their function and eventually lead to this compulsive use despite negative consequences that defines addiction.
Okay, so let's take a quick pause for a neuroscience lesson on how our minds learn things like language, movement, behavior, and even addiction.
That's right. The learning process for everything we do starts in the brain cells, called neurons. These send chemical signals called neurotransmitters to communicate with other neurons, which in turn send signals to your body to perform an action. Some of those neurotransmitters, like dopamine, make you feel good and want to repeat that behavior.
Yeah, so for example, when you work out, neurons release dopamine, which reinforces your desire to keep exercising, so you do it again.
Exactly. And as that process happens over and over, a neural connection is formed and a lesson or association is learned. But when the brain is introduced to drugs like fentanyl, morphine, and heroin, that natural process is interrupted.
Opioids are especially dangerous because they hijack the brain's typical reward process by flooding the system with an unnatural amount of dopamine. Dr. Luescher has focused much of his research on studying how brain circuits are remodeled with continued drug use and says the synthetic opioid fentanyl has a high potential for addiction.
So there are two properties that fentanyl has. It's very potent. That is, it's 100 times more potent than morphine, which means that you use 100 times smaller quantities to fully activate the receptors. So this is one of the properties that makes it very dangerous. The other one is that it is very fast. The half-life is only 20 minutes, so you have an effect within a short period of time, and that also contributes to the addiction liability.
It's the potency and power of fentanyl that has law enforcement trying to find a way to stop the flood of drugs into American cities.
The quantities are so small, and of course that also has an effect on the market, which means in order to get the substance across the border, it's much easier because you need lower quantities. And there's estimations that a couple of trucks actually are sufficient for the entire supply of the US for an entire year.
In 2022, the Centers for Disease Control identified fentanyl as the leading cause of drug overdose deaths in the country. In April of 2024, an average of 30 people died of drug overdose per week in Seattle alone. More than 80% of those deaths involved fentanyl.
Right now, the current treatments for opioids are to reverse overdose and help people survive withdrawal and cravings through medications. But to truly treat addiction, Luescher says we must investigate how the brain processes drug withdrawal.
So we understand how the fentanyl activates the dopamine system. So this is a crucial element. And one study that we have recently published suggests that this is very different on how fentanyl induces the aversive state of withdrawal. That is, when someone takes fentanyl, obviously this is a pleasurable experience, but when then the fentanyl is no longer available, they go into withdrawal. And up until now, people believe that this is just sort of the flip side of the same coin. That is, you stimulate the reward system so strongly that when the drug is no longer available, that leads to this aversive state. And our research now suggests that it actually is a separate pathway, that there are other parts of the brain that are recruited and responsible for this withdrawal aversive state.
But what if you could avoid withdrawal and stop addiction at its source? According to Luscher's research, the answer may lie in studying the addiction circuitry in the mouse brain. Through a process called optogenetics, researchers use light fed directly into the brain to turn neurons on or off in a specific cell or cells, reversing compulsion.
So the good news is that since addiction is governed by synaptic plasticity and no cells die, in theory, it's all reversible. And we have been able to show in animal models that indeed you can restore normal transmission and through that also restore baseline behavior. That is, the animal, the mice that have changes in their behavior, when synaptic transmission is normalized, they will reverse their behavior and behave as if they've never seen the drug before.
While research into optogenetics for treating addiction in mice has been successful, actually finding ways to manipulate the circuits in the human brain is a long way off. Dr. Luscher thinks continued study of these genetic interventions is a promising step to finding successful treatments for humans.
What I'm always arguing is that through optogenetics in an animal model, you know what you should be doing. Then the question becomes, can you do it in humans with the techniques that are available? So it helps you focus on a more specific goal. One of the question is whether we can actually translate optogenetic approaches to the human. And there are many questions that are associated to that, which slowly people are now trying to address. And there are, on the other hand, FDA-approved circuit therapies in humans, such as deep brain stimulation, transcranial magnetic stimulation, and focal ultrasound. And these techniques, while much less specific than optogenetics, could possibly be refined to do the job.
So let's go back to our conversation with John Wilson from Seattle's Recovery Cafe. We asked how much he believes genetics and personal history led him down the road to addiction.
There was never no trauma. There was never no neglect in my household where I grew up at. So it wasn't a matter of being abused or I don't believe it was traumatic for me to leave my siblings and go. I did feel isolated. I did feel like special. I was a special need kid, being adopted by. I was adopted by my aunt and uncle. Now in the house, since they weren't my biological mom and dad, maybe there was a missing link there that caused something in my brain. And I just, when you're in an urban city, you're influenced by a lot of things. And in the environment that I was in, there's bars, and I believe that may have played a part in it. But the bottom line is that I was just curious.
So we know that our genes play a big role in addiction. But how do those addictive tendencies get activated? Dr. Luscher says those genes can be turned on or off because of epigenetics.
That means external factors like environment, exposure, stress, even your upbringing can affect what genes are active in your brain and therefore addiction vulnerability. But with thousands of genes, how do you know which ones to target?
So we need to have better understanding on the epigenetic mechanisms and the genes that are turned on that confer this addiction vulnerability. So I think that's one of the crucial elements to understand why someone is really at risk when taking a drug and someone is less at risk. Because that also applies for drugs that are legally available. I mean, the same holds true for alcohol. Some people can use, most people actually can use alcohol an entire adult life and never lose control. Yet some people do, and it is a major health problem. If we knew how to better understand the individual vulnerability, that would be a big step forward.
Lucier hopes our understanding of the neuroscience behind addiction will help change public perceptions and policies.
If you understand how it happens, that will help reduce stigma, because people with fentanyl addiction and addiction in general still face a huge amount of moral judgment. And knowing what exactly is going on will help reduce that. So I think that's the first and foremost goal that we have with our research. And then obviously, beyond that, it inspires new therapies. It helps us understand the relative changes or the differences between different types of drugs. And it helps us understand how addiction vulnerability comes about. And that may have impact on policy. Of course, a lot of the limitations that we face still has to do with the stigma associated with addiction, which touches, of course, people who are affected by addiction. But it also affects the research and the foundations and companies that are willing to get involved. And so this is still an issue that many of the big drug companies are very reluctant to develop programs for efficient treatments of drug addiction, because they don't want to have their name associated with a disease that has this connotation of moral failure.
Stigma is not just a barrier to research, it's also a barrier to kindness. Recovery Cafe's founder, Killian No, says sadly, it's part of our culture to look at people struggling with substance use with disdain.
There are things that are, there are addictions that are celebrated in our society and addictions that are stigmatized and despised. And it just breaks my heart that for drugs like fentanyl, you don't get many mistakes, if any.
Right.
I think that's what breaks my heart. And if we truly can move as a society, and this is where stigma comes in, I think, because it allows us to not move to this place of claiming that we belong to each other.
If it weren't for Killian's compassion and understanding of addiction, many people, like John, would have nowhere to go.
Just coming to the Recovery Cafe itself, learning how to be social, learning to care about somebody else. My form of giving back is that I try to get with guys one-on-one, to try to help uplift them and give them some hope. So it's a big transformation. I don't need to, that's all I need to say as far as that goes.
We can actually look at addiction without any moral judgment. It is a disease like another too, and some people are more vulnerable than others, and they have the misfortune that they actually, in the end, suffer from that, and we need to do something for them.
For a public health crisis as dire as addiction and overdose, it'll take a team approach, a battle that can be fought and won on multiple fronts, from the compassion and support of social services to the insight and innovation of science. I'm Amity Idrisi.
I'm Liz Dewicki. Thank you to Dr. Christian Lucier, Killian No, and John Wilson for sharing their stories and insight.
This episode of Lab Notes was produced by Amity Idrisi, Peter Kim, Liz Dewicki, and Rob Piercy.
For more episodes and science research news, visit our website, alleninstitute.org.
Thanks for listening.